Alright everyone, today we start by talking about Politico, because they're trying to defend communist China by a little bit of weasel words. In their article, link in the description, archived of course, the point is made that somehow China as a whole, like the Chinese people, all, 2 billion of them, are somehow interchangeable with Xi. And so if you criticize U.S. corporations for dumbing down commentary and communication among people here to appease China for entirely money-related corporate reasons over the Hong Kong issue, or if you have a problem with China destroying the world's environment with being the world's largest polluter on virtually every metric, by being a massive bully to its neighbors, Vietnam and Japan notably, among others, Taiwan, the legitimate China. Even the U.S. government isn't brave enough to recognize that one, but I think that Taiwan #1 in that case. Tiananmen Square, human rights abuses, suicide nets on Apple factories, and basically just a dysfunctional, dystopian sort of society that took the worst, most authoritarian aspects of communism, took the economic side of communism, threw it to the wind largely, just retaining the core of centrality, and then created an actual totally laissez-faire free market, basically. If you got enough money today, you're a U.S. billionaire. And this is what a lot of U.S. billionaires do. You can go to China and build your factories and stuff. There are very little in the way of any regulations. Building permits? What the fuck's a building permit? The Chinese government says you can have a factory. Just bulldoze some homes. Build your factory. Emission standards? Safety standards? Working hour standards? Pensions? What the fuck are you talking about? It's a total free market. It's a free-for-all. You can abuse and exploit people. You can rape your own workers there, and probably the Chinese government, if you give them enough money, doesn't really care. I think if you have a stick up your ass about Chinese people, the best way to make sure that they maximize abuse and don't get ahead and suffer in life is to keep the Chinese communist government going. Hell, if opposition to the Chinese communist government is pro-Chinese people, most people in China are totally ground down. It's very funny when the 50-cent posting squads come. And they do this whenever you criticize China. To say, well, if you've ever been to China, it's not actually that way. Well, yeah, there's a burgeoning middle class in China that have the equivalent of lower middle class homes here. They said they live a couple miles further from the carbide factory. Other than that, it's a wasteland. The Chinese government says, well, we're going to plant 1 billion trees in the next decade. Wonderful. You'll reforest a tiny proportion of what you've already slashed and burned to make room for more pavement, to make room for more coal-tailing dump sites, to make room for more shit shacks and ghettos. They're wonderful to the Chinese government. So Politico is trying to defend them. I mean, let me ask this, and this is rhetorical because I don't really, it's harder for me to dig for this info than others. Somebody can do a little digging. Look at the companies that advertise with Politico. How many of them have ties to China? Like either they've got a headquarters there or a subsidiary there, branches over there, they do a lot of business in China, and then look at the proportion. If someone can dig up that info, I bet that it's significant. I bet there's a reason that this article exists. The idea that criticism of Xi as a single individual correlates to a hatred of China or Chinese people is totally and completely wrong. People criticize the United States all the time. Most often what they mean is the U.S. government, or some reigning aspect of culture, some cultural moray or way of life or law, some norm in that culture. I criticize, for example, the EU. I'm living in an EU state. I have no problem with Europeans of any type. I do have a problem with the EU's actual authority. That is, the body that convenes in Brussels to grind people down. I do that out of a belief, by the way, that it's bad generally for most of the people in Europe. It's pro-European to be anti-European Union. It's pro-Chinese to be anti-Chinese government, because the Chinese government is an illegitimate, authoritarian, abusive, tyrannical regime that is not properly elected in any meaningful sense, that masquerades on the world stage as a legitimate diplomatic force while simply swinging its weight around, having manipulated itself into a position where it can exploit globalism in order to lean on U.S. and European firms. That's what it's about. They even bully the Russians around. Remember? Years and years ago. I talked about this jovially at the time because it was a symbol of things to come with BRICS. Russia wanted a fuel deal with China. Hey, we need to sell some of this fuel. We're going to build a pipeline into China, and we're going to serve some of these northern cities. Russian oil, I believe it was, or gas. China said, yay, sounds great. They started building the pipelines while the Chinese delayed negotiations for months at a time. Once the pipelines were nearing completion, the Chinese balked at the cost and said, we're going to pay you pennies on the dollar of what we told you we would pay for the oil, by the way. And Putin, he left early. He was at a meeting there with Xi at the time. He stormed off back to Moscow several days in advance. There was a reason for that. What the fuck were they going to do? They already built the pipeline. They got to sell the material to someone, and because of their unique situation as the piggy bank of BRICS, Russia can't alienate them. China's gotten into a position where they bully Putin around. They haven't done that, the Chinese government rather, through any particularly sane strategy, just the mass exploitation of them and their nearby neighbors. Just by being a complete bully that needs to be taken down a peg. Mentioning that has nothing to do with anti-Chinese sentiment. If China were a democratic country with Western standards, nobody here would be having a problem with them. The problem is that Xi is weaponizing globalism to try to benefit totalitarianism, and that's what China really is. There are people in this country who are either complicit in this, people like Pelosi who have ties to China, who won't say anything, who will namby-pamby them, handle them with kid gloves, and they love Xi and they want him to show up for tea, I guess. They want to be able to go to China and see, paper dragons moving through the streets, so they don't want to say that he's Winnie the Pooh, I guess. They want their next vacation in Beijing to be a nice one and not result in the KGB showing up or whatever fucking red agents they have there. And then there are people who are directly tied to China and make their living, like a Mitt Romney deal. Like, money gets laundered all the time through globalism. Globalism is a cancer. It's funny when people claim to be liberal and they actually support the concept of globalism, which really means global exploitation by totalitarians and corporate leaders and banks that fleece and shill the population, and walls of propaganda and complete dystopia. It's interesting how the devolution of the world into essentially globalized dystopian slavery is actually now considered to be a left-wing value by some people. I think they might be a little bit fooled and deluded. I think that their movements may have gotten infiltrated somewhere down the line by people who were a little bit red. Let's just put it that way. It's not a new McCarthyism to note the reality that it is. It's under globalism. China, which is very insular and protectionist, abuses and exploits the outside world. That's just the way that it is. Pointing that out has nothing to do with, I hate Chinese people. No, it has nothing to do with that. It has xenophobia towards Asians or any of these other buzz terms that Politico can dig out of its ass. Nothing to do with that. Nobody has a problem with the Philippines, with the government there. More people on the left have a problem with that. Japanese government, fine by me. Taiwanese government, Vietnamese government, all these other different movements and groups and organizations seem to be functioning nominally. By the way, Vietnam's supposedly still communist too. The kind of human rights abuses that you see in Beijing, you simply don't see in Hanoi. I understand that there are still problems there because it's still technically far leftist and more authentically so than in China at this point. But the kind of abuse and the scale of it and the lengths to which the government goes to hide that fact pales in comparison to anything you find in China on a good day. So yeah, I'm going to keep criticizing China, and if Politico thinks that that's anti-Chinese, you hate them because of xenophobia from the mid-1800s. You've taken it from your great-great-grandparents and how they mistreated their Chinese workers building rail lines. It's like, no, and I don't really care about Politico's judgment because, again, if you look at who funds them, who advertises with them, and who partners with them, I bet anything that a lot of them have ties directly to China. In the most direct sense, like one step removed. I'm not talking five steps from communism to a U.S. firm. I'm talking one step. Or even not, maybe even not one. Some of the firms could be Chinese. Literally, they could be based in China. I wouldn't be the least bit surprised. And any firm based in or doing significant work in China comes under the diplomatic influence of Xi himself. That's just the way that China operates. It's not like here where there's a stopgap generally between direct coordination between the political elite and businesses. Here they use middlemen or lobbies or super PACs. They still trade money, but it's a little bit more roundabout. And it can at times be a little bit more honest because you have representative government on the local and state level too. You don't have that in China. Your local provincial mayor or governor or whatever the fuck he would be over in China is simply appointed by Xi because he's the one who gave Xi the best present or killed the most of his enemies or something like that. He's basically a power-mad dictator, light. It's a semi-oligarchic system, semi-plutocratic system, semi-tyranny. It's a really weird fusion model. It's like a gorgonic monstrosity built on the worst aspects of every possible political persuasion. Every possible political group, China took the worst aspects, the most abusive, centralizing, authoritarian aspects of all those systems, lumped them together, rebranded it as still totally normal communism, and now foists it upon the entire world and seeks to spread it out like tentacles. That is what's happening. It's funny because, like, when people look back in the past, we always joke about, like, propaganda against the British in the late 1800s or something, and it always depicted the British Empire as like an octopus slowly reaching out and grabbing all these colonies. Soon it'll come for the U.S. If they hadn't fallen, that could have actually happened. Hindsight is 20/20. Foresight is definitely lacking. People always think that the fight that they already fought and won was never actually worth fighting for because the worst never actually happened. After the fact, it's easy to say that. We have to fight an ideological struggle against communism. The Cold War is definitely not over. If anything, it's worse now. Because now we're fighting an enemy that's not isolated from us, but rather one that took up a different strategy. Russia's strategy, a la the Cold War, the Soviet Union, separate from the US. We are the other people. We are the other bloc. You do business with us. China said, no, that's not the way to do it. Fuck that. No, the way to spread communism is you start doing business with the other country and act very warm and friendly. Oh, look, yeah, U.S. investors, you can make so much money over here in China. Put up your factories, make them reliant. Give them opium, if you will. It's basically what China did to Western investment. We need to wean our businesses off of China as quickly as possible. The easiest way to do that is by people understanding that this is the way that it's working, and then boycotting these businesses, telling them don't back down to any attempt by China to influence you. If you do, you'll lose our business. Make it unprofitable to work with China because it's the only reason they're there. They don't care what country they're working with. If they were working with multiple different countries, it would be so much better. It would be so much better if these U.S. firms were doing business with 5 or 6 different nations so that they could switch from one to the other if one got too abusive. But unfortunately, China became a monopolistic exporting muscle. That's what happened. That's about all. Peace out.